There are ways to die that are tragic. There are ways to die that are painful. And then there is what the Romans invented for the one crime they considered unforgivable. Imagine a punishment so specific, so meticulously designed for terror that it required a legal recipe. It didn't just need an executioner, it needed a dog, a monkey, a rooster, and a viper. For centuries, historians debated if this was real. Could a civilization that built aqueducts and wrote laws really sew a living human being into a leather sack with 4 terrified animals and throw them into a river? The answer, unfortunately, is yes. This is the story of Poena Cuulae, the punishment of the sack. It was Rome's way of saying that you didn't just deserve to die, you deserved to be unmade. You deserved to be erased from the earth, the water, and the memory of mankind. Today, we are going to open the history books to the darkest page of Roman law, not to glorify the cruelty, but to understand the terrifying lengths an empire would go to maintain control. Because the true horror of Rome wasn't the madness of its emperors, it was the creativity of its justice system. To understand the punishment, you first have to understand the crime. Rome was a patriarchy in the strictest sense of the word. The pater familias, the father of the family, held absolute power. In early Roman law, a father legally owned his children. He could sell them into slavery, he could banish them, in extreme cases, he could even execute them. The father was the state in miniature. He was the cornerstone of Roman society. So what happened when a child struck back? Parricidium, parricide, the murder of a father, mother, or close blood relative. To the Roman mind, this wasn't just murder, it was treason. It was a crime against nature itself. It was an act that threatened the very stability of the republic. If a son could kill his father, what stopped a citizen from killing a consul? What stopped a subject from killing a god? The Romans believed that the blood of a parent stained the earth in a way that regular blood did not. It was a pollution, a miasma, that could bring down the wrath of the gods upon the entire city. Therefore, the killer couldn't just be executed. A simple beheading was too clean, too dignified. The killer had to be ritually purified and then removed from the cosmos entirely. This is where the horror begins. The legal theorists of Rome didn't want the killer to touch the earth because they would pollute the soil. They didn't want them to touch the sky because they would pollute the air. They needed a void, a place between worlds, and so they created the sack. The process of Poena Cuulae was not a quick execution. It was a slow, deliberate theater of shame. It began immediately after the verdict. The condemned person, let's be clear, this was a real human being stripped of their rights and humanity, was first seized by the lictors or executioners. The first stage was the virgi sanguinis, the rods of blood. The prisoner was stripped naked and beaten with blood-colored rods or whips. This wasn't just about pain, it was about reducing the person to a state of raw, bleeding meat. It was about stripping away the dignity of citizenship. In Rome, citizens were generally protected from corporal punishment, but a parricide was no longer a citizen. They were a monster. After the scourging, the prisoner's head was covered with a bag made of wolf skin. This is a crucial detail. The wolf was a symbol of Rome. Romulus and Remus were suckled by a she-wolf, but it was also a wild, predatory beast. By covering the killer's face with wolfskin, the state was declaring visually, you are no longer human, you are a wild animal. Then came the wooden clogs. Heavy wooden shoes were placed on the prisoner's feet. Why? Because, as we mentioned, they were not allowed to touch the sacred soil of Rome. Even their final walk to the river had to be insulated. They were already ghosts, walking on wood, separated from the living world. They were marched through the streets to the riverbank, usually the Tiber in Rome, and there, waiting for them, was the culeus, a massive watertight sack made of ox leather. And waiting beside it were the animals. This is the part that sounds like mythology but appears in the legal digests of Emperor Justinian and the writings of Cicero. The Romans didn't just drown the killer, they threw 4 live animals into the sack with him: a dog, a monkey, a rooster, and a viper. Why these 4? Historians have debated the symbolism for centuries, but the prevailing theories paint a dark picture of Roman psychology. The dog. In ancient Rome, dogs were not always the beloved pets we know today. Scavenger dogs were seen as unclean creatures that had no respect for boundaries. A dog would eat its own vomit. It was a symbol of shamelessness. The monkey. The primate was seen as a caricature of a human, a grotesque mimicry of the parricide himself, someone who looked human on the outside but had no human soul. It was a mockery of the killer's humanity. The rooster. Ferocious and territorial, but more importantly, the rooster was associated with the dawn and the passage of time. By killing the rooster, they were symbolically killing the time the murderer had left. The viper. The snake was the most direct symbol. The Romans believed, incorrectly, that young vipers killed their mothers by chewing their way out of the womb at birth. It was the ultimate symbol of matricide and parricide. Imagine the scene at the riverbank, the chaos. The animals would have been terrified, screeching, barking, hissing. The executioners would force the beaten, bleeding prisoner into the leather sack, and then, one by one, the animals were thrown in with him. The monkey scratching and biting in panic, the dog snapping at everything in the confined space, the snake striking blindly in the dark, the rooster flapping and pecking. Then the mouth of the sack was sewn shut. This is the moment of absolute nightmare. Inside the sack there is total darkness. The air is limited. The prisoner is trapped in a confined space with 4 panicked, aggressive animals. The noise would have been deafening, the screams of the monkey, the barking of the dog, the screams of the man. The sack is then hoisted up, sometimes by a crane, sometimes by strong men, and hurled into the river. The impact with the water would have been disorienting, but the horror was just beginning. The sack was watertight. It didn't sink immediately. It floated. Inside, as the air ran out and the animals went into a frenzy, the struggle for survival began in a space the size of a large trunk. The prisoner wasn't just drowning, they were being mauled to death while suffocating. And as the sack slowly filled with water or sank under the weight, the final part of the punishment was achieved. The Tiber River washed the sack out to the sea. The body was never recovered. There was no funeral, no cremation, no tombstone. In Roman religion, a soul without a proper burial was doomed to wander as a lemur, a restless, malevolent spirit, forever. They hadn't just killed the man, they had damned his soul for eternity. When we look back at Poena Culi, it's easy to see it as cartoonishly evil, but we must remember this was the law. This was written by educated men in togas who debated philosophy and justice. It serves as a chilling reminder of a fundamental truth about human history. Civilization is not a guarantee of humanity. The Romans were civilized. They had courts, lawyers, and judges, and yet those very institutions designed a torture method that relied on the psychological terror of being trapped in a bag with a snake. It teaches us that justice, when driven by fear and a desire for purity, can become a monster worse than the crime itself. The Romans wanted to wash away the stain of parricide, but in doing so, they stained their own history with a cruelty that 2,000 years hasn't been able to wash away. This was only the beginning. If the punishment for killing a father was this horrific, what did Rome do to those who dared to challenge the state itself? In the next chapter, we will look at the punishment that became the symbol of Rome's power over the bodies of the poor and the rebellious,
a punishment designed not to hide the victim in a sack, but to display their agony to the entire world. Next, we discuss crucifixion.
The theater of agony. Crucifixion. If poena culae was designed to hide a criminal from the world, the next method was designed to do the exact opposite. It was Rome's billboard, a warning sign written in human flesh, posted on every major road of the empire. We've seen thousands of paintings of it. We wear it as jewelry. We see it on church steeples. But because of this familiarity, we have forgotten what it actually was. Crucifixion wasn't just an execution. It was a medical marvel of torture calculated to keep a person alive and screaming for days. When the Romans wanted to kill you, they used a sword. When they wanted to destroy you and terrify everyone who ever knew you, they used the cross. This is the reality of the serval supplicium, the slave's punishment. And be warned, the historical truth is far worse than any movie has ever dared to show. Who ended up on a cross? If you were a Roman citizen, you were generally safe. A citizen might be beheaded, a quick, honorable death. But if you were a slave, a pirate, a rebel, a member of a despised religious sect, you were meat for the machine. Crucifixion was the weapon of the state against the other. It was the ultimate tool of psychological warfare. Following the revolt of the gladiator Spartacus in 71 BC, the Roman general Crassus didn't just kill the 6,000 surviving rebels, he crucified them along the Appian Way. Imagine that. 6,000 crosses lining the main road from Capua to Rome. A corridor of dying men stretching for 120 miles. Every traveler entering Rome had to walk past miles of rotting bodies, smelling the stench of death, hearing the groans of the dying. It was a message that required no translation. This is what happens when you defy us. It was state terrorism in its purest form. How did it actually work? The popular image, a tall, clean cross on a hill, is often wrong. First came the flagrum, the whip. Before the cross, the victim was stripped and scourged. The Roman flagrum had multiple leather thongs tipped with lead balls or sheep bone. It didn't just leave welts, it tore the skin open. It exposed muscle and sometimes bone. Many victims died here, their bodies going into shock from blood loss. But the executioners were experts. They knew exactly when to stop to keep the victim alive for the main event. Then the walk. The victim didn't carry the whole cross, which would weigh over 300 pounds. They carried the patibulum, the heavy horizontal crossbeam. It weighed 75 to 100 pounds. Imagine having your shoulders flayed open by a whip, then having a rough wooden log tied to your raw wounds and being forced to drag it through the mocking crowds of the city. When they reached the execution site, always outside the city walls, but always near a busy road, the patibulum was hoisted onto the upright post that was permanently fixed in the ground. Then came the nails. Archaeology gives us a grim picture. In 1968, the heel bone of a crucified man named Yehohanan was found in Jerusalem. It still had the iron nail driven through it. The nails were large, 5 to 7 inches long. They weren't driven through the palms, which would tear under the body's weight, but likely through the wrists, right between the radius and ulna bones, or through the hand with ropes binding the arms for support. Driving a nail here strikes the median nerve. Survivors of nerve damage describe the pain as lightning or fire. Now imagine that fire shooting through your arms unceasingly for days. But the nails didn't kill you. That was the genius of the cruelty. The nails were just the fasteners. What killed you was gravity. Crucifixion is essentially death by slow suffocation. When the body hangs by the arms, the weight pulls the rib cage into a fixed, inhaled position. The lungs can draw air in, but they can't push it out. To exhale, to take a single breath, the victim has to push themselves up. They have to pull down on the nails in their feet. They have to scrape their scourged back against the rough wood of the cross. Push up, exhale, scream in pain, sink down, suffocate. Push up, exhale, scream in pain, sink down, suffocate. This cycle continued for hours, often for days. The victim was trapped in a rhythmic dance of agony. If they relaxed to stop the pain in their nerves, they suffocated. If they pushed up to breathe, they triggered the fire in their wounds. They had to choose between pain and death over and over again, thousands of times. And they were not alone. Roman crucifixion was a spectacle sport. The cross was low to the ground. The victim's feet were often just a foot or two above the earth. This allowed the crowd to look them in the eye. It allowed stray dogs to snap at their legs. It allowed the insect to settle on their open wounds. The victims were stripped naked. They lost control of their bodily functions. They were dehydrated, sunburnt, and tortured by muscle cramps that locked their bodies into rigid knots. It was the total dismantling of a human being. Sometimes it took too long. If the executioners wanted to hurry things up, perhaps the Sabbath was coming, where the emperor wanted to clear the site, they would perform the crurifragium. They would take a heavy iron club or a mallet and shatter the victim's legs. This sounds like a final act of brutality, and it was, but in the twisted logic of the cross, it was also a mercy. With their legs broken, the victim could no longer push themselves up to breathe. The cycle was broken. They would hang there, unable to exhale, and suffocate. But often they were just left there, to thirst, to hallucinate, to wait. The Roman orator Cicero, a man who saw many terrible things, called crucifixion the cruelest and most disgusting penalty. He wrote that the very word cross should be far removed from the eyes, ears, and thoughts of a Roman citizen. It was a horror that even the Romans knew was too dark to speak of in polite society. And yet they used it millions of times. Why did they do it? It wasn't just sadism, it was policy. The Roman Empire covered 2 million square miles. It ruled over 60 million people with a relatively small army. How do you keep 60 million people in line? You don't need a soldier on every corner. You just need a cross on every hill. Crucifixion teaches us that the famous Pax Romana, the Roman peace, wasn't peaceful. It was a silence bought with terror. The beautiful marble statues and the wise philosophy of Rome were paid for by the screams of the men and women dying slowly by the roadside. But fire could be just as effective as wood. In our next chapter, we will look at a punishment that turned the human body into a torch, a method that the Emperor Nero used not just for execution, but to light up his garden parties. Next, we discuss the tunica molesta.
We think of fire as a tool, a source of warmth, a sign of civilization. But in the hands of the Roman state, fire became a costume. Imagine standing in a crowded arena. The games are ending, the sun is setting, and then a procession of prisoners walks out. They aren't in chains. They are wearing stiff, heavy tunics that smell of pine and chemicals. They are tied to stakes, and then a torch is touched to the hem of their garment. This wasn't a quick death. It was a performance,
The Romans called it the tunica molesta, the annoying tunic, or irritating tunic, a horrific, understated name for a method of execution that turned a human being into a screaming candle. It is perhaps the most sadistic fusion of theater and torture in human history. And it shows us that for Rome, death wasn't enough. It had to be a show. Who wore the tunic? Like the cross, this wasn't for everyone. This was for the arsonists, the traitors, and most infamously, the Christians. The most famous use of this method comes from the reign of Emperor Nero in 64 AD. After the Great Fire of Rome destroyed much of the city, rumors swirled that Nero himself had started it to clear land for his new palace. Nero needed a scapegoat. He found one in a small, secretive religious sect that people already viewed with suspicion. The historian Tacitus, who was no friend to the Christians, described what happened next with grim precision. He wrote that their deaths were made into sports. They weren't just executed, they were used as lighting. This brings us to the unique psychological horror of the tunica molesta. It reduced a human life to a utility. You weren't just being killed, you were being used as a street lamp. Your agony was providing the ambiance for a garden party. It stripped the victim of their humanity so completely that they became furniture. How did they create a human torch? The tunic wasn't just cloth, it was a trap. The garment was made of papyrus or heavy linen, but it was soaked in a deadly cocktail of flammable substances. Pitch, a thick, sticky, tar-like substance derived from plants. Bitumen, an asphalt-like sludge. Wax and resin to help the fire stick. The victim was forced to put this stiff, sticky garment on. It would have felt heavy, cold, and smelled of chemical death. Then they were marched to the stake. Crucially, the stake often had a hook under the chin. This was the uncus. Its purpose was terrifyingly practical. It prevented the victim from slumping forward as they burned. It held their head up, forcing them to face the crowd even as they died. It ensured the audience got a good look at their expression. They were tied tight. The executioner would approach with a torch. When the fire was lit, it usually started at the bottom. Fire travels upward. This meant the legs burned first. The victim would be fully conscious as the flames consumed their lower body. The tunica was designed to burn hot and slow. The pitch and resin acted like napalm. It stuck to the skin. If the victim thrashed or tried to rub it off, the sticky, burning tar would just smear deeper into the flesh. The pain of a severe burn is widely considered the most intense pain a human can experience. The nerve endings are overstimulated to the point of shock. But because the fire started low, the vital organs, the heart and brain, were kept safe for minutes. Minutes of screaming, minutes of smelling your own flesh cooking. The smoke was thick and black, choking the victim. Often they would die of asphyxiation from the smoke before the fire actually reached their chest or face. But not always. If the wind was blowing the smoke away, the victim remained conscious until the flames reached the upper body. Tacitus writes that Nero opened his own gardens for this spectacle. He drove his chariot through the crowd, dressed as a charioteer, mingling with the guests, while human beings burned on stakes around them, illuminating the night. Think about that image, the Emperor of Rome waving to the crowd, illuminated by the flickering light of dying citizens. It is the ultimate snapshot of absolute power corrupted into absolute madness. But the Romans didn't just do this in gardens. They did it in the arena as part of mythological reenactments. This is where the tunica molesta gets even darker. The Romans loved to see their myths brought to life. There was a myth about the hero Hercules, who died by putting on a poisoned shirt that burned his skin off.
So, for the midday entertainment, they would dress a condemned criminal as Hercules. They would put the pitch-soaked tunic on him, and the crowd would cheer as they watched a real-life Hercules burn to death. They called this fatal charades. It wasn't justice, it was a play. The victim was an actor who didn't know their lines, forced to die for the sake of the plot. The crowd could detach themselves from the cruelty, because in their minds they were watching a story. It's not a man dying, it's Hercules, they could tell themselves. It was a way to numb the conscience, a way to turn murder into art. The Tunica Molesta teaches us something terrifying about the human capacity for cruelty. It shows us that we can justify almost anything if we dress it up, if we call it a myth, if we call it a necessity, if we call it justice. The Romans didn't hide these executions. They didn't do them in dark dungeons. They did them at parties. They did them at festivals. They turned the most painful death imaginable into a sideshow attraction. It forces us to ask, what happens to a society that treats suffering as a spectator sport? What happens when we stop seeing the human being inside the tunic? But the arena had one more horror waiting, one that didn't involve fire or crosses, but teeth and claws, a punishment where the state didn't even have to lift a finger. They just opened a cage. In our final chapter, we look at the chaotic, bloody reality of damnatio ad bestias, being thrown to the beasts. Next, we enter the Colosseum.
We end our journey on the blood-soaked sand of the Colosseum. You've seen the movies, the brave gladiator fighting a tiger, the hero wrestling a lion. But that's Hollywood. The reality of damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, was not a fight. It was a feeding. It was the lowest form of execution in the Roman world, lower than the cross, lower than the sack. If you were sent to the beasts, you weren't considered a human being. You were considered meat. This wasn't combat. It was a biological disposal system. And for the Roman mob, it was the highlight of the day, the lunchtime show. While the elite ate their bread and wine, they watched men and women being eaten alive. This is the story of how Rome turned nature into an executioner. The Roman games followed a strict schedule. Morning, beast hunts, venationes, trained hunters tracking and killing wild animals. Afternoon, gladiator combat, the main event, skill versus skill. Midday, the executions, meridiani. This was the lull in the action. Many spectators left to get food. Those who stayed were treated to the damnatio ad bestias. The victims were the worst of society in Roman eyes: runaway slaves, foreign enemies, deserters, and of course, the Christians. They were brought out naked or in simple tunics. Sometimes they were tied to stakes. Sometimes they were forced to run across the sand. Sometimes, in a twist of cruel irony, they were given weapons, wooden swords or dull daggers, to give them the illusion of a fighting chance. It made their panic more entertaining for the crowd. The animals were not natural predators. They were tortured prisoners just like the humans. Lions, leopards, bears, boars, even ostriches and hippos were imported from Africa and Asia. They were kept in the dark underground tunnels, the hypogeum, for weeks. Crucially, they were starved. For days before the games, the animals were given no food. They were beaten with whips and poked with hot irons to make them aggressive. When the trapdoors opened and they were lifted into the blinding sunlight of the arena, they weren't hunting for sport. They were insane with hunger and fear. They attacked anything that moved. This removes the noble image of the lion. These animals didn't kill cleanly. They mauled. They crushed. A starved bear doesn't go for the throat. It starts eating while the victim is still screaming.
Just like with the tunica molesta, the Romans loved to dress this up. They didn't just want to see people die, they want to see a story. They staged elaborate sets in the arena, fake forests, artificial hills. They would dress a prisoner as Orpheus, the mythical musician who could charm animals. The prisoner would be forced to play a lyre among the trees. Then, instead of charmed animals, they would release a hungry bear. The crowd would laugh as the myth went wrong. They staged the story of Pasiphae, the woman who gave birth to the Minotaur, by putting a woman inside a wooden cow and releasing a bull. It was a snuff film with a budget. The elaborate sets served a psychological purpose. They distanced the crowd from the reality. It made the violence feel like fiction. "Look at Orpheus run," they would cheer, ignoring the man bleeding out on the sand. The scale of this slaughter is hard to comprehend. When the Colosseum opened in AD 80, Emperor Titus held 100 days of games. In those 100 days, 9,000 animals were killed. The number of human victims is unrecorded, but likely in the thousands. Under Emperor Trajan, 11,000 animals and 10,000 humans died in a single festival. These weren't just executions, they were extinctions. The Romans killed so many animals for these games that they wiped out the North African elephant. They exterminated the European lion. They emptied the forests of Nubia. The arena was a machine that consumed nature and humanity in equal measure, churning out blood to keep the mob happy. We look back at these 4 punishments, the sack, the cross, the tunic, the beasts, and we shudder. We call them barbaric. But we must remember, Rome didn't hide this. They were proud of it. They put it on coins. They wrote poems about it. They took their children to see it. The Romans believed that this cruelty was necessary, that without this terror, civilization would collapse. They believed that order was worth any price in human suffering. And that is the final dark lesson of Roman history. They were the most advanced civilization of their time. They gave us law, architecture, and language. But they also proved once and for all that civilization and morality are not the same thing. A society can build the Colosseum, an architectural wonder of the world, specifically to watch people be eaten alive. The stones of the Colosseum are still standing today. Tourists take selfies there. But if you listen closely, beneath the noise of the modern city, you can almost hear the echoes, the roar of the crowd, the growl of the lion, and the silence of the victims who were fed to the machine of empire.